And what we will do today is to celebrate Labor Day and the story of labor. Stories of labor, I feel, are stories that need to be told, um, especially in a context where the space for labor to articulate and organize their voices are increasingly limited, especially so when we think about the field work and the projects that we do where labor is not even organized or is seen as outside of the realm of organizing. So when I think of my own field work with agricultural workers in farms, that's a form of labor. When I think about the work with um, peasants, who work on lands that they don't own, and yet have very little of that share of the food that they put their labor into, that also is labor. Of course, the questions of labor today resonate across the globe as global systems of production have become so mobile that they can move wherever regulations are poor and where labor can be exploited. As a result of that, many of the stories of labor actually go unheard because there are such concerted efforts in drowning these stories and ensuring that these stories are not really heard. Increasingly, therefore, we also, I think, have a sanitized space globally when we think about work, for instance, or when we think about the technologies that we consume to perform our everyday work. The labor often goes hidden. So even within the narratives of automation, where we think about so much automation taking place that people have been rendered redundant, there is the other side of the picture, which is that to produce the technologies that actually automate, you need workers. And often you need large numbers of workers working in concentrated efforts over extensive periods of time. But again, when we use our iPad or our iPhone, when we engage with these technologies, that labor behind the technology goes hidden. It remains erased. So I hope through the many stories that we share today from our field work, the stories of the voices of labor, that we can also create some kind of imaginations for the ways in which these stories disrupt the erasure of labor that takes place every day in the world in which we live. I also hope, part of this is that Labor Day, when we think about it, it has turned into such a celebratory day or a holiday without really, again, connecting it to the story and the history of labor and the organized struggles of labor, to have a voice and to actually express the class interests of the working classes. So perhaps the stories we share also are imaginations toward narratives of class, narratives of the worker that assert particular frames for us to think about the world, the way it is organized, and relationships of work, profiting, and capitalism.
What Dr. Joseph said reminds me of several random things. One is about the automation of machines taking the place of workers. On the other hand, the workers being the one who is working towards that automation or machinery development of the current society. It reminds me of an analogy that I learned in one of my doctoral class that likened these workers as the yeast. So throwing into a bottle of grape juice, turning that sweetness into real good alcohol, or alcohol accumulated to a kind of concentration, then kills the yeast. So basically, I'm thinking that these workers are forced to concoct their own poison in a way, a kind of like a social poison. But in this case, the analogy fails because that no workers should be regarded as microbes, as something that is working but without any kind of without notice, without being taken care of, or without taking care of themselves, but instead as a social power. Another one is about people, the agricultural workers working on the borrowed land, and then without enjoying the produce that they themselves produce. Actually, it reminded me of a poem that is more than 1,000 years ago in Chinese, and I like to recite that. 昨日入城市，归来泪满襟，变身罗辑者，不是养蚕人。So basically, the title of it is the silkworm razor or silk maker. So the first line is yesterday. This lady went to the market, and second line, when she came back, her clothes was soaked in her tears, because she saw that all the silk wearers in the market, none of those are the silkworm razors. So you can see it's the same kind of like logic that is working like thousands of years ago in China. So that's kind of like a random connection that I have to Dr. Dada's remarks.
I think this is similar around the world, like what happens in Bangladesh, a lot of women, young girls from the countryside, they're coming to cities because they want to end up in factories where they work as a worker. They lose their lands, properties, and they don't have any other means. That's why they're coming. And they're really low paid worker. I have been in there is a theatrical performance in University of Dubai. The performance name is Consume. And there is a special mention about especially sweet shops and all these consumers products. And Bangladesh came out many times how much they're underpaid. Even Bangladesh government didn't allow, they supported the factory owners. So they asked for a minimum wage like 8,000 Bangladeshi local currency, which is $100. They didn't allow. So low wage is like now in Bangladesh is around 4,000. It's less than $50. This is the trajectory of Bangladesh. That's why America always feeling all the brand shops always feeling that this is the best place to manufacture all this brand product, because even India couldn't compete, even China couldn't compete with this cheap labor, and they have overtimes, and they have all these tragedies of ill management, and sometimes they get burned, sometimes building collapse, they couldn't get out, they didn't quit compensate, they always been fired. And what I feel this Bangladeshi migrant workers project, they are always in fear that whether I should be fired next day. And they always working overtime. Here, the trajectory of Bangladeshi migrant workers, they always love to get overtime work, especially during the weekend. I asked, don't you would like to take some rest? No, man, I will get paid double. So I want it. So one of the relationship with the supervisor or the foreman is that, okay, they will make a really fair deal with them. They will abide by the rules, or they will try to make them happy. And in terms of that, they will get their days during the weekend. Most of the common punishment for the Bangladeshi migrant workers here in Singapore, if their supervisor is from different culture, and if they have a kind of conflict, so they don't get their days during the weekend. So I mean, having paid $4,000 to $7,000 for coming over, and couldn't save more than $200 to $300 per month from whatever they are earning per month, and they have to send all the money, all these $200, $300 to their family because they have to pay the loans and they have responsibility of family. They couldn't even get back the money they put or recover their money to put to come here. And when they got wounded, injured, that's another story. I could show you in my presentation. There is one guy, his name is Zakir Mirza. He is from a same class, well-educated family from my region. In Bangladesh, most of the migrant workers coming from my region. That's my birth district, Tangai, next to the Yomanu River. He just went back. He had a lot of problem with his lungs, and he was been working in MRT. So he has been using a chemical to fill up the blanks or some kind of that sucks the water from the wall, something like that. It's a heavy kind of chemical. And he went to the doctor, sees doctor says nothing, but he has been working on this for more than 2 years or 3 years. So there is something injury. He was feeling weak, then he left job and he went back. I couldn't interview him because he was not an injured worker according to my law frame or all these things, but he talked to me a lot personally. He shared me a lot. So most of the time they get back with nothing. And it's not the trajectory of Singapore, whatever I feel that around even in Bangladesh, when they end up in the sweatshops or factories like that. And all these factory owners or middlemen, even sometimes they got some kind of legal, legal process to face, but they always get support from the authority and they could get back to their place. They don't have any punishment, any much punishment, even they don't have any way to get capital punishment. Compensation, oh well, you can put some compensation and there will be big news on media, but actually there is no system to get any compensation. So I don't know how to convince, especially in our country, still I think day before yesterday the TIFCA agreement already been signed, and one of the agenda of TIFCA agreement, because they will get GSP from the US, benefit from the US, that is part of the getting much more benefit for manufacturing industry work, but they didn't get it. Because in the meeting, the US ambassadors and US agencies say that that's belong to WTO. So it's always, all this goes back to the manipulation of labor.
Yeah. Last week was the anniversary of the Saturn Run of Fire.
Right. Last week is the anniversary, and our friends, all the activists did huge demonstration around the country. Government didn't pay it.
There were a lot of pressure from international NGOs, more than one. I think I forwarded a petition, and then they've done a lot of work. But some of the firms agreed to change, the mode of production and improve the health and safety record. But a lot of them are still, especially Gap, big players like Gap.
1,300 plus people died on spot. And there is not even a list. They didn't publish a list of the people. The BGME is the Bangladesh Garments Manufacturing Association, something like that, the big industry, and the government give them some kind of support, some of the families, maybe 10, 20s or 100, but they didn't come up with any page briefings. They are asking for it. And what is the policy for checking this compliance, whether it's with the healthy or they have the fire exits, all these basic things. There are two groups now. one group is supported by the US-based company. Another group, but all this manufacturing factory owners, they don't want to see the other people there.
And there've been activists in the UK. They did a fantastic thing last week, and it's a human chain.
Right.
Around many blocks in Oxford Street is the main shopping, with all the kind of big department stores like Primark.
Right.
It's so cheap. It's so cheap. That's what people so was chock-a-block, But you buy anything for £3, $5. What is that? There's no. Nobody makes the connection. What comes so cheap in such an expensive city, but I'm glad that this happened. At least they're trying to raise the. And the other thing we'll probably like to show later is the foreign domestic workers who've been working on protocols. There's only been 3 sessions, something like that. They come up with some really poignant work, and they finding their voice. And finally, they produce a contract, and you got pictures of them holding a contract in an anonymous way. But I'm very, very happy the way things are going. They're beginning to open up and talking to all of us, and some of the stories are really kind of gut-wrenching. And similar things like, they 7 months after the first year contract, they don't get paid. Mm-hmm. Talking the wages for 7 months.
I found stories like I interviewed 31 almost 35 persons, and 1/3 of them said that they didn't get paid some of their dues. 1/3 of them said that some of their earlier dues, when they changed job, they moved from one place to another place, they might get $300, $700, $800, all these payments they didn't get back. And when some of them asked for the payment, they had been brutally beaten.
Because they have asked to be paid.
Right. They ask for their dues. Like it's to them like 2 months, 3 months salaries.
These are construction workers.
Yes, construction workers. Because the trajectory here in Singapore is different. One company get a IC or work permit for certain worker like rooming, but after a couple of months, few months, they give this worker to another company. They call it subcontract or something like that, which is really strange. So the second company, when they hire them, they don't feel any kind of responsibility even after the accident. So again, this responsibility goes back to the first company, and they don't know all these rules, regulations. They just know that they can have a kind of compensation if there is an injury. They don't know most of the information. Even the lawyer, they don't tell them. So it is first important thing for the labor of Bangladeshi migrant workers. They need to know what are the labor law, what kind of things they could claim, what they couldn't do. Sometimes these stupid associates of lawyer give them really bad idea. Like, okay, you get a wound, you will get a compensation. Cut your hand, come back to me.
What is the national government's story about that?
Government? I
So
interviewed,
how did they comment on the
I
same-
interviewed almost 35 persons. On the top of them, I have talked at least 200 person in person. All of them said that, oh, if we go to the embassy, they treat us badly. Even though they don't even know, they could get a document from the embassy if they have a legal evidence. I have a copy of the evidence I will show you at the presentation where embassy wrote that this person was being beaten, something like that, take action. So they don't even know they could get these documents. And some of them told me that these documents don't really work in MOM or somewhere else. So all this information gap, even sweatshops in Bangladesh or here, And these people are not really really like they could read and write. They could read Bangla well, they could read English, and they could understand, really, because most of them are grade 11 graduate. Like when from the lower middle class family, from the countryside, when they get graduation, they don't have anything to do, and they don't want to put more money for higher education, or they end up with something, political association, then their guardian or their family friend think that, okay, let him try to get a job in abroad.
Mm.
So they were never habituated with doing this kind of hard work. The earlier generation did, they are farmers, so they used to do farm work, all this laborious work. So when they end up in Singapore, they get really trouble.
So these stories also show something. They show the gap in the stories that are shared with us, that has become part of our common sense about growth, economic progress, about the idea of the free market. You know, the story that is often told, which is that economic growth creates job opportunities, and therefore for the worker from Bangladesh or the worker from Philippines, this is an opportunity for them to earn money, albeit it is low because there is no minimum wage, but they can go back to the Philippines and build the house. They can go back to Bangladesh and build the 2-story pakka house and get their sister married. So the stories we are fed are stories of success, where putting in the labor translates into the economic benefits that you make in order to move ahead in life and get out of poverty. And yet the stories that you share, be they stories within Bangladesh, within these spaces, such as in the garment industry, or be it as a construction worker working abroad at a site, that the labor that you put in does not translate into the economic benefit that you get.
Yes.
Often, in fact, the labor that you put in is unpaid. And it is worth documenting the extent to which that is widespread. Often that is projected, like say in an Al Jazeera story, as a product of the economic downturn, that companies, you know, went downhill and therefore were not able to pay for the labor that went into the companies. However, that is never really again juxtaposed against the economic flow of cash, meaning that when economies went downturn, where there are still particular segments of the population, the 0.01% or even lower, that still continued to make money and make profits and get bonuses, such as when you think about the large finance industry, AIA bonuses that were given out right after the financial crisis. The government had actually come in and pumped in public money, and these large financial institutions went back and gave financial bonuses to their top paid workers. So you again, that is, you juxtapose that contradiction. So here you have people at the lowest of the low levels who are not getting paid for the labor that they are putting in. Yeah? And then you have sort of the minuscule, the some percent, a fraction of the population that continues to make the money, make the profit. So this contradiction then, when you listen to these stories, also raises a question in terms of what is the role of the state? What is the role of society? What is the role of structure? Particularly in accounting for something as basic as payment for the labor that one has put in. I mean, we are here not even talking about negotiating a minimum wage. It is not even about that. It is something as unjust as you have put in the work, you're not paid. And then think about it in a wider context. So when you raise that, what happens? You're stuck for another few months in an unpaid status, trying to, go through the case as it is being decided upon. So more unpayment. So
More insecurity, like
more insecurity.
when they first arrived, there are stories. They have been put up in a kind of accommodation where they got only $4 to $10 per day for their meals or something like that. For a few months or couple of months, they don't get any job. When they got job, so they cut down their all these accommodation facilities. Sometimes they couldn't ask for it, how much they cut it.
Or it's not told to them how much they cut, right? It's some random amount.
Right. Even their passport been kept with the office of the employer. Employer. Right. Passport, they have their copies.
So is this, on Labor Days, there's a kind of question to ask, is this a new slavery?
We actually thought of the word slave. We came up to and we talked about it.
It is a type of slavery. Because I'm paying money for you. Right? Whether I pay you as per contract, whether you even know if this contract exists is another story altogether. Whatever your agent tells you back home, it can be a fairy tale. It is often a fairy tale. Right? And then they come in here. I think it was about 10 maybe over years ago, there was a write-up about all these people in Little India. Back then Little India was quite a different scene. They used to just sort of lie around the corridors of the back lanes, like, what's the name of that road? I forget now. Dunlop Street, and then behind that, you have all those minion roads running around. So they just lie around there. They got no place to go. They can't go home. They don't have their passport. Nobody's giving them anything. Then I think that started the movement for migrant worker centers, and slowly the groundwork started to go on. And then they started uncovering all these very unethical contractors who used to bring them in and house them in very marginalized conditions. And then slowly, because there's a social responsibility also for the state, but these people are coming to work here. And I think at some point there was also some parallel drawn to the Middle East, like in Dubai. When you go there, there's another world altogether. So this was like very early research that was surfaced in the Straits Times. I think about 15 odd years ago. People started to get aware of the problems and the issues. Not a problem, because it can be sorted, so it's not a problem. It's just an issue.
That's so beautiful.
Which I think brings to mind the tragic irony that is Labor Day. I mean, if you think about it, any kind of holiday that appreciates a group of people, to me it makes me think. Well, I did an article quite a few years back about Valentine's Day, and Valentine's Day, everyone knows how it's so commercialized, and we're buying chocolates and we're buying flowers just for this day. But if you actually research into the history of how Valentine's Day came about, it came about because of a resistance. Because I think the Roman Emperor or something was forbidding people to get married, and then some underground movement was happening so that was helping people get married. Some Saint Valentine. It's the same with Labor Day, where it was born out of labor movement resistance and collective organizing
We
and
don't know that
union
story.
movements. So it's so ironic that now it's hidden under an appreciation of labor, which you think about it is just another way of saying that, we can appreciate you for one day out of 365 days a year, and
Around the year we don't know you.
yeah, and everything else is exploited. But if you think further into that, how much that hides just even the word labor, and how much we take for granted that something that earning a wage is so normal for us, so taken for granted that we can sit in an office, we can write papers, and we can earn money for that, when it actually supports systems that are so systemically unjust. So if you're just happen to be born to the wrong class, you have no bargaining power left, and it gets, I know, it's just a huge system if you really go into it, and yeah, it just makes you feel so unfair. I mean, Rumi was talking about that play we were watching. It's called Consumed, and
Consumed, right.
I mean, the story was about a department store owner, and then how they did research into the clothes they were selling, and then they realized that there were all these sweatshops and how all the people were being mistreated, and then they were reenacting all these stories from all the laborers, and these are things you don't stop to think about. When the show was over, there was a post-show dialogue, and I remember someone asking, it was a question that was burning at the back of my mind, and someone else asked it. I think he or she asked, you know this, you did all this research, you put on this wonderful play, how do you feel about it? I mean, it's the question that we always think about when we do critical work and we do CCA, where you come to this point where, okay, I'm aware now, this top was probably made in that Bangladesh factory as well, your shoes were probably made in a sweatshop somewhere else. What can you do? So I think for that play, at least, when the actors and the crew were talking about the research, the answer they gave, I thought, was quite nice, where it's something that when you first know about it, I mean, it's like an epiphany, it's an illumination. At the same time, it makes you feel so isolated, because you feel so helpless. But I think that's where we come in, or research comes in, or like arts or plays like that come in, where you're supposed to bring it to raise people's consciousness about it. And again, it goes back to the collective organization and the movements, where you have to build that critical mass, and where you just need enough people to know and realize that, and get over the fact that they are not alone and everyone else is feeling that way, and then hopefully something else will be done. But I think in doing that, you have to recognize that the issue is so huge. I mean, we're talking about global movements of money. It boils down to someone not having a home, not being able to go home because their passports are being retained, not earning enough money, being abused. But if you look at it on a macro level, it's a huge industry, it's a huge business, and all this on the ground work makes a small effect, but we all intellectually, we all study the theory of it, and we all know the system, and we all know that the only change that can have some impact, it really is a huge systemic, structural change. And envisioning that, I think it's part of our duty of us being here to figure out how that works. Yeah, that's enough reaching for me. Okay, back to ground stories.
And coming back to you pointing about the play, that at the end of the play, all the crew and the director of the play, they have really positive assuring with the audience. They said that, especially the director said that she is aware of shopping. She doesn't know where to buy a lot of things. She loves to go around and shop, but now she is scared that, okay, I don't know where it's coming from.
Where it's coming? What's the source?
What's the source?
You see how embedded we are in that kind of system.
Because I with Primark, I will have to admit, I walked into a Primark store for the first, I was like, holy shit. Imagine how much stuff I can get for how much.
Exactly.
The whole family.
And then there is a disconnect though, because I'm at that point not thinking, like what you said, the director going about thinking, where is this coming from?
Right. And I think Korean member also, they are convinced that they are not consuming as much they can consume. So at least that group is, after that play, they feel like that, right?
The point is that they're saying they're not consuming much, but they still have to consume, because that is the only way to live. And it's just, when you really think about it, there's really any other way to live. I mean, if you think about it, all this, I'm starting to sound very anti-capitalist, but the system that it is a capitalist system where it's about products and services, you transact it for money, and then you realize only after you think about it that it's actually sustaining like private ownership and things that you think about they shouldn't be owned. You know what I mean? Things like cleaning the hallway. Who owns the hallway? Who owns the fields that grow the cotton that puts the shirt on your back? You know, it's ground. You know, who lay claim to that? Who lay claim to the oil that makes all these other countries in the Middle East rich? You know, so it goes down to again concepts of ownership, concepts of exchange. Yeah. But again, these are all the big problems, and then as you can see, they have huge material consequences. Yeah.
There's this also nexus between greed and violence that is self. I mean, and so there is this excess. So the consumption per se is fine, but it's not sustainable because there's excessive greed. And I'm saying greed because it's so unequal in terms of consumption, right? And the violence, so there are different ways in which we can interpret violence as, you know, this just the physical aspect, but to also material. So when these two are going together, it's really a very, very it just self-perpetuates and makes the inequalities worse and worse.
So
and the solution is not in hiding, you know, but actually opening up, because I think that when the Singapore government 15 years ago has acknowledged that there is an issue, right? But the solution has been that okay, we're going to hide them away from public view, but I'll provide housing. But then when we go to the houses, we see that you know, then after that what?
Beneath that layer,
There's so much still happening. But there is, and all of this, and the violence, of course, there is violence in the family, there's violence in the community. I mean, there's also a lot of giving and taking, and actually I was so touched by the amount of kindness I saw amongst those who have the least. That was so moving, how selfless they were. Even though you would think that in that position,
you would want to protect.
You would want to be so protective and be in a survival mode. Yet they were so civilized. That was the face of civility, to be to exhibit all these positive human values when you have a lot of excess is easy. But in that situation, to be like that is very moving to see that. But nobody should be in that. I mean, because we always think in terms of deserving. That whole moral thing of do they deserve, especially when I think the hunger thing when we talked about. There's always some rationalizing or justification. But then it's not even about, when we're not even talking about whether the pay was right. We're just talking about whether you promised something and did not deliver that. Yes. Even if what was promised was very meager. How can you even not give what you promised? I think that is that is the most unethical thing.
And you know, Shrivi, and I go back to something that Daniel said, and you know, I've been reading a lot of Gandhi, you know, and so one of the things, it's something that is often circulated is, you know, Gandhi's notion that be the change that you want to see in the world. So part of that transformation is in our own journeys, right? But also recognizing in that process that perhaps we are not alone. That is very powerful, that there are others that we can relate to, that connect, that alienation that is so intrinsic to this greed, because we need to accumulate because we are alienated. The moment you feel that, no, I'm not alone, I'm connected, and I'm connected with these people, that's a discursive shift, but also a material shift perhaps, that disrupts this idea of greed, and greed driving our behavior, our tendencies to accumulate. So I wonder to what extent this search for other ways of living, other livelihoods, also as much spiritual or metaphysical or cultural search as well, meaning that looking for other kinds of cultural models. And surely there are plenty of those other kinds of cultural models that do exist. So I mean, so how we relate is, say, not knowing where our clothes are coming from. Sort of the opposite of that is Gandhi's idea of Hind Swaraj, right? Which was sort of revolutionary in the context of Indian independence, which was the spinning the yarn and making your own cotton.
Subsistence.
And subsistence in a very localized way. And not only I know where it is coming from, but I own and I give my labor into what I put on my body.
Later taken by Dr. Schumacher, Small is Beautiful in the 60s, all the kind of go back to small holdings and
Local.
Yeah, basically, rather than just this huge, factory farms. It was a great concept to come, especially in the hippie generation, but very, very timely.
The erasure seems so powerful. The erasure in terms of, you think about us, we are fairly knowledgeable, informed people, and think about the friends we have, they are fairly knowledgeable, informed people, usually having a degree of some sort, right? And then you think how little we actually know about what is going on elsewhere. That erasure actually works, because to the extent I don't know what goes into the production of my iPad, I don't have to be held accountable for using my iPad.
Because it's a huge cognitive load. I
Yes.
mean, if you want to be that kind of informed shopper that does
With everything.
research into every single thing, you're just going to sit there and not do anything. Yeah.
Or
Yeah,
or the alternative is actually coming together and getting like-minded people to come up with different ways of living. And I think that speaking of this, I find myself meeting a lot of people that might be in the same kind of mode of thought, that have already compiled lists of places that we might seek for alternative sort of resources, or alternative ways of eating, alternative ways of purchasing.
Yes.
And it's just whether we want to band together collectively and start sourcing for these environments or for these spaces.
And be organized again
And-
for that, no?
And be organized for that, pretty much. And it's just really, I think the whole idea of bringing people together and creating that is the way forward, and knowing different people and how they go about living in those ways can be very useful in determining and making change as well. When you have a large proportion of people coming together and saying, we want more of this or we want more of that. Like, I think for the longest time in Singapore, it was very, very hard to go to a nice restaurant or go to a nice place to get vegetarian food, for example, or let's not even use the word vegetarian, food that is not cruel to a human being or to an animal. And over time, because communities have started to band together, whether it's for religious intention or whether it's just because you've just decided to live a more sustainable way of living, whether you're an environmentalist or whether you're an animal welfareist or an animal rights person, if everybody just banded together and come up with different ways and provide a different type of market, a kind of different demand for the way that we want to live, I think it's very possible, and that's where that moment of transformation can happen. Yeah. So I don't think it's impossible or it's difficult. It just requires a lot of effort on the part of the individual as well to enact that change. So it can move from knowledge to more
Action.
action, more behavioral.
But that will be supported, like you're saying, if there are these networks of solidarity. So if it isn't that hard, for instance, for any of us says that I want to wear clothes that are manufactured in not cruel ways. I cannot go and spin a yarn right now in my life, but I want to wear clothes that are not cruel. That be available.
And I think that part of that is also having the impetus to search for those communities because they exist. We can sit here and sort of discuss this is not available and that is not available, but when you actually look, you will actually find. So I know of this lady her name is Vadivu, and what she is essentially doing is she's writing a pilgrim's guide to Singapore. And basically what she's essentially putting together is a list of spaces that is fair trade. It is, where you can get clothes that are, they know the source, where it's coming from, soaps, tourist items, or even finding a space that has been built in an environmentally friendly way. So for example, I think Stella McCartney, for the more high-end consumers who want to live a bit more ethically, they've actually opened a store at Hilton Hotel, and the wood chips that they've used have all been recycled. So exactly where, and all of their products are actually vegan. So there's a lot of exploitation removed from this kind of spaces, and she's putting that together for Singapore alone. So spaces where you can go consume or even get a massage from people that really need that labor. For example, visually handicapped massagers, as opposed to going to a massage parlor, an ordinary massage parlor. Different spaces to eat where they know exactly where how the meat was built, not in a factory farm and so on. So this pilgrim's guide has already been in different countries. It's already been organized, and now she's making one in Singapore. So I think it's also about getting connected and finding these resources, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
And I also think, organizing in that sense, like how we do, say, in a culture-centered project in grassroots organizing, right? That, say, a lot of economies do that want to find livelihoods in a very grassroots way. It's sort of another space when you locate it in relationship to a space like, say, Guide to Fair Trade, where you sort of, that leads you to Stella McCartney. And the reason I say that is because I also worry that can itself become a fetish, where you're consuming fair trade and pretty much, like the conscious capitalism, dharma capitalism stuff that have started coming out, you live capitalism by the way of dharma. That again takes away the power of organizing to me in some ways, because the solution at the end of the day is high-end consumption where I will pay out of my pocket to consume that. So,
I think that there is value in connecting the ones who are already in that space. Very often they're working alone, and there are some things we can borrow from businesses in terms of ideas of how we can translate skills from different backgrounds, how we can economize in terms of making the system more efficient, in terms of connecting people and making sure that we're not repeating the same things or borrowing knowledge from one another, ideas. And then the other side of it, there are many sides to it. One is we work with the ones who are already in this space and network them and organize them, and so that one, you recognize what they're doing, reward it in that way, and then try to scale up that effort in ways that is efficient and also inspiring to one another. The other thing is that we work with organizations who are the worst offenders, so to speak, and identify, and this I'm using the logic of media rise right here, identify people within that organization who are likely to be change agents and to raise the consciousness from within, who are influencers but from within. And because that's important, we have to identify them and empower them to bring about a change from within that organization. because only others outside connecting is one thing, because that it will still be seen as the other. So from how do we bring a change from within? Because there are people, like even big organizations, everybody is not you, and hopefully that person is senior enough in that organization or that industry to be able to speak and raise the consciousness of that industry, practice and change it, not just in a very window dressing way, but change it fundamentally. And then the other aspect of it is to work with citizens or consumers and raise their, just change their ethic of culture of consumption, to not just move to an alternative way of consuming which is more ethical, but to consider the act of consumption itself, even if it's is itself as at the root of it. And this has to happen from when you're a child to, when your child asks, why is so and so, why are they poor? What are you telling them? Or when you ask for some more, what are we saying? And then how do we bring that change as a behavior, not just something that you just know, is probably by involving in the community more, integrating. There are so many ways we're so segregated. We just live in our own spaces, we don't go and see. So it's not real. So how do we make this? The stories are important, that's why. Because it makes it very real. We see the face of that issue.
I love the dialogic part, Shruvi, that you're talking about, and sort of then as an element of that, consumption becomes a pathway for engaging dialogically, right, in these organizations. And at the same time, perhaps there is also a need for, like Daniel was articulating earlier, solidarity with workers' movements, meaning the dialectical part of it, which is actually going to be in contradiction, in opposition as resistance, so that those voices can percolate up, can be amplified in terms of actually demanding for what is basic right, so that something like you work and you not get paid, that doesn't happen,
I was reminded of, when you were talking about the ethics of consumption, I was reminded of, the philosophy course that I have taken, and then the kind of like tension between ethics and the economic logic. So basically that when we are talking about ethics, we cannot afford to forget about the economic logics, especially when it is the mainstream, it is the most powerful way of promote consumption, or consumptionist or nism is itself promoted by this economic growth. What I meant is that if we think about the ethics of raising kind of awareness from early childhood, then we are thinking about this ethics of consumption in a kind of large social scale. But then at the same time, I'm imagining, how about these low-income families and individuals? Can we think of these busboys, old busboys in Singapore, being paid $1,000 per month, still have a rent to pay, and also be able to afford their very expensive fair trade goods versus their manufactured goods. So basically, if you persuade them to do that, then will their livelihood otherwise, meaning have enough to eat, also being the ethics of living. So
ethics of consumption is twofold, right? At one hand, it is reconsidering what those in power structures and elite circles consume, which is consumed too much. If you look at the data, what is it? About very small 15% of the world consume 85% of the world's resources. But then it is also trying to make sure that 85% have access to consuming
Mhm.
the very basics, the nuts and bolts, food, clothing, shelter.
Yeah. And then my reflection of this violence of labor. So basically, if there is an outbreak of labor, 100 or several hundred people were killed, we call that the violence, against the labor or laborers. But then there is a everyday violence of
Yes.
labor, the structural.
Violence,
some
yes.
System.
when we talk about hegemony, we always say that's the consent, to gain everyone's consent. But then sometimes it was mistaken as everyone is willing to do something. But then in real actually
Coercion.
existing, hegemony, it's always like coercion.
Yes.
It's like whether or not you are willing, you have to do this. This is the most sensible, rational way for you to do that.
Right.
Basically,
So in the case of the Bangladeshi workers, this is a great example because one might argue that it is hegemony, that they participate in their own exploitation. But if you really break it down, it is coercion that operates on the basis of one lie, which is the lie that is told to them when they are recruited. And the moment they buy into that lie, right, which is that a job abroad will give you the riches, the moment they buy into that, then they are trapped into the cycle of coercion.
but
A
even if
Bangladeshi
they,
worker in Qatar, I was just thinking through this by talking to an activist friend, cannot get out and escape that scenario once they are trapped. Their passport has been seized, they are being monitored constantly, they are literally, taken to rooms and then, shut off. You don't have access to that space, their movement is restricted.
a very powerful scenario against that will be, especially for the migrant workers. So why do you come? So you are mistreated, why do you come? Why don't just live or work in your own country?
And you see
So-
that in the local media reports as well when they were
Yeah.
talking about the Little India riot. And I hear this narrative a lot from the people Singaporeans who discuss the Little India riot. Like, well, if you wanted to do this, then why did you come in the first place? If you're not happy, then go back. We pay you pittance. And that whole article that came up, if you think that it's pittance, then go back, and you have nothing there, then you will know what pittance means. These sort of articulations have come up when, I ask Singaporeans about the Little India riots or their view about the Little India riot. It's as though they have completely washed their hands off this, or they have this idea in their head that this is just the way it is.
But also that it is choice.
It's a choice, yeah.
It's a false
Yes.
choice, idea of choice.
So it's like the similar one is that they are bumper stickers saying that go back to your own country. You don't even speak English. That's United States. So basically, it's a racial kind of hatred together with a kind of actual international
Divisions of
difference
labor.
of division of labor and difference of
But then you
wage.
say again they work hand in hand because that kind of racism prevents, it's the classic imperialist divide and rule, right? Which is that kind of racism, if you breed it, particularly among the working classes and the poor,
Yeah.
then they don't find solidarity with the other workers. They are here to take away the jobs. I don't relate to them, I don't connect to them. And that continues the exploitative cycle.
Yeah,
they
it
see
reminds
it as a
me
threat
of
rather
that
than as-
that panel we went to, the migrant workers panel. So we had one of the activists, was it Jolovan? He was saying that Singaporeans asked him, why are you helping the foreign workers here? Because you're not helping Singaporeans. Why are you so anti-nationalist? I mean,
That's
basically.
exactly the question
And
I
then
got
he
asked
was
as well.
saying that if you help the foreign workers, then you help Singaporeans because then they're not being exploited, then the wages are not so low, and then
Yes.
Singaporeans will get better wages, It
It's-
helps each other.
Yeah, you can say it's not anti-nationalist. It's actually anti-internationalist in its current form. So basically, I'm not
Anti-humanist.
anti-social, and I'm anti against the society in its current form. Dr. Dada just said that the moment you sign the contract, you are in a trap. But the moment you refuse to sign a contract, you are in your old trap.
Yes.
That is the poverty
That's-
trap.
yes.
The
So it is trapped both ways.
yeah, the immediate agent change, from the home country, exploiter to a foreign country exploiter. But then the general theme of how capital works, how exploitations happen, it becomes a kind of like a transnational, international theme. So especially when 2008, when the world is saying that, we are in an economic recess, financial depression, what China is doing. China is kind of like doing that in a celebratory terms. A lot of malfunctioning or low profit margin companies just went out of China because of the raise of labor cost, funding profit margins elsewhere, and then the Chinese government is saying, now this is the perfect moment for us to upgrade our industrial structure. So basically from the manufacturing intensive into research and design plus manufacturing. And then this is a pink story because that basically when you go to China, you can see still a lot of manual laborers. But then on the other hand, it is to say that whenever there's a kind of financial crisis, it's not a crisis usually over the board for everyone. It's usually the crisis for the poor and the needy. Actually, the superpower of the financial, are doing just fine. And then this economic geographer just used a term called a vagabond capitalism. So it's like a vagabond. So
I'll go wherever I can make the profit.
Yeah, especially you need a visa, passport, you need to be checked constantly to see if you have a half a year or 6 months margin.
I don't need anything.
But capital does not need that.
Right.
See the beneficiary policies in different countries.
I think what China did in 2008 was very smart, because they increased domestic consumption, because they couldn't sell so much. Okay, well, let's concentrate on that and raise the level of really standard of living. A lot of people end up consumption, and whether you like it or not. But I think in a way it brings us back to the role of state. And in the case of China, obviously, state is very, very strong and monolithic, but sometimes can have a good, effect on the citizens. Obviously, there's a lot of things that went wrong there, but transplant that, say, to Brazil under Lula president. So had a socialist president who was a political prisoner and who gave land to the millions of landless peasants, the Movimento Sem Terra, back in the about 8 years ago in the first administration. So there are ways where the state, can be a beneficial actor, or at least
And align with the people.
and align with the
and
people,
interests.
and align. In the case of China, for other reasons, whatever, because they were forced into it. In the case of Brazil, because there was a tremendous momentum coming from the and the president was obviously sympathetic to that, and coming from that sort of background as well, which would bring us back to Singapore and why is the state not doing anything about?
But at the same time, the state is though.
Yeah.
As if you think about some of the contemporary discourses on the elderly, for instance, not just discourses, but shifts in policies with respect to addressing the needs of the elderly. With respect to healthcare, for instance, I think of that as one example. The state is attempting to respond as well, because the states are in this interesting space where you have to appeal to your people to be able to govern. That's your logic of governance, right?
We have to be very careful of those types of narratives as well, and the kind of packages and policies that are coming out, whether they are long-term or they're just temporary solutions for the upcoming elections. So I think that we have to be very critical about, this sudden change.
Right, but also that is a window, right, Satveer?
Yeah.
Because that is a window to demonstrate. I see this in the case of India quite a bit, in terms of the politics of the popular, meaning that the politics of the popular, which is outside the realm of civil society, outside the realm of people like us. These are the uneducated slum dwellers and squatters who have the power through their voting power, and they leverage that voting power to secure resources, because the state needs you to be able to govern. And I think that's a powerful modality of entry point as well in terms of this kind of solidarity. You can make the state do things
Yeah.
if you have that kind of solidarity.
Unfortunately, in Singapore, as much as we look towards that, we have to recognize that there are literally two parties, and one party doesn't have the power to have 80 seats in parliament or 84 seats. It has the potential to have what? Maximum of 20 seats in parliament. So it doesn't have to push that much for making change or for that much in terms of their policies as well. You know, it's not something that, you know, unfortunately that is precisely the problem with not having like a proper democracy set up in a state, because then it's not accountable to that
The people in
the
that
popular
kind of way.
yeah.
No.
To the popular.
And also we cannot assume that all the people as such will be enlightened enough
Yes.
to make the choice that way, because there is so much of corruption also happening where people's votes are being bought, and although they are the people at large might be trying to use that opportunity to put
Yes,
pressure,
absolutely.
but sometimes they're not even aware, they don't even see beyond, they don't think that they deserve that or they don't even see that this is unfair and this is unjust, and then how do we create that shift
Yes.
to even get there?
And Shirley, the other point is, A, how do we create that shift? B, where the shift is already happening or where communities are actually doing those, how do we celebrate that as examples? You know, so I think of so many examples of grassroots organized movements. These are people's movements that have thrown out the big corporate from a very exploitative scenario. How have they done it, you know? And I think those models, those stories need to be told again and again for other communities as well.
I think underlying all that also in the sense that all this undeserving, but knowing what you're worth, what you're entitled to, and the notion of exploitation is probably to question the logics behind a wage labor, basically what you're being paid for, and what's your labor worth, what are you laboring for? I mean, if you think about it, some jobs you're being paid to work on a computer, but what about the emotional cost of staying in the cubicle for 9 hours a day? Are you being paid for that? Or a construction worker, you know, you're being paid for those hours where you lift heavy stuff. Are you going to be paid for the lifetime of bodily damage that you're going to sustain for the few years that you are able to carry stuff? So all this notion of work and labor is something that we don't normally question. We don't normally ask these things. So that kind of opens the gateway or the doorway to exploitation, because you're going to say, you're just being paid for this. Because I'm paying you for this, I'm not going to bother about anything else in your life. You know, like where we see all the examples of the migrant workers where like, oh, you got hurt on the job. Are you sure you were on the job or just outside the gate?
Because if I can just delineate that, then I don't need to pay you.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think this is the problem of contract labor as well, right? The idea of this concept of contract work.
It's not just contract work, so it goes up into even maybe things that we don't consider traditionally exploitation, like labor, sexual discrimination at work, gender discrimination, sexuality discrimination.
Yeah.
All these kinds of things where the employer say, I didn't employ you because of your sexuality, when there's a discrimination that, oh, you are a woman, you can't go beyond a certain position, but that's not being spoken. That's also a form of exploitation.
Absolutely.
Where they say you stay at
and that is
home.
unwritten,
Yeah.
right, into the...
It's unwritten because
Right.
technically you're not being paid for that, but actually you are, because you can't separate, you know, I do my work. You know when they say you leave your work at home, you leave your... That's not...
And then, you know, so can we take up our sharing of the voices after Kang's talk?
Yeah.
Because the class starts at noon, but I wanted to wrap up with a thought, which you know, made me think of, is that then, do we think of ourselves, you know, are we bourgeois, the elite? Some of us clearly are, I think I am, you know, but...
Some of us.
and that's
Is that income line?
But that's why I said it. But there are others of us that are laborers, academic laborers. So you think about what you're doing. Kang, you think about what you're doing as a postdoc. Then you think in the US context, for adjunct, So one of my students, brilliant student, Raven, she went on to become an adjunct, and she teaches 6 modules a semester. Okay, she's literally killed, right? And she makes peanuts as salary, doesn't get access to health insurance because she's contractual. And so much of universities across the globe are being organized this way, where academe is becoming a site for contractual labor, where people don't have labor rights, and
No, they are frequently reduced to 3 courses because up to 4 courses, the school has to buy them the insurance. Yeah, according to Obama's new policy. So then
So that's a new policy,
really,
huh?
yeah,
I didn't know
and then it's really like.
So again, that's interesting. That must have come out of organizing. That delineates that if you're going to do more than this, then it is.
The thing is that now the school only give each one like 3 courses. So before they can teach 6 courses, now they can teach only 3.
And so
Yeah.
their earning power also gets
Yeah.
reduced.
Backfired.
Yeah, so it backfires. I think the idea of contractual labor in itself is one of the worst forms of violence on the labor movement.
Because I could kick you out anytime.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that is one of the
That
most
uncertainty.
exploitative forms of work that has been, and that has been a very recent influx of contract work in Singapore as well. Like previously, a lot of them they would stick to much like the Japanese model, right? If you stick to a company, you are there for a long time, you get your pension, you get all of these benefits even after you finish work. But with the influx of contractual labor, all of that changes, and the companies now can make much more money. So why would they want to retain
Pay you
staff?
and
And yeah.
In the UK, it's terrible. I mean,
Of
I've
course.
only been paid hourly paid myself, but I haven't done that much lecturing, really working in the industry. My ex-wife is was a really good postgrad from the LSE. She's a Berwick, teaching international relations, with 0-hour contract. They cannot guarantee this from month to month, And it's incredible. And like her, there's lots and lots of highly qualified.
Did you all see the story in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, and then that got picked up elsewhere, with this woman who taught for many years the core English courses as an adjunct, ended up being homeless
Oh my God.
because she just didn't have the money to afford, the mortgage rates when those had gone up. So Satvi, something you said, it makes so much sense, and it resonates as the uncertainty and the insecurity, that we could be any day in the streets.
And I think that reality only seemed to come across after doing the Voices of Hunger project, because you look at very normal, everyday people who, where one illness,
Away from people, yes.
anything can just put you on the streets overnight. One credit card debt you couldn't pay, and then it gets one to another, or it could be one illness
one
that
person in the family is
one-
bedridden,
yeah,
then you have
that's
to
it.
take care of them, and then you can't go out, and then that's it.
That's another. Exactly.
But then you think about solidarity when these stories connect. So I was sharing this with Shrivi, when the stories on Voices of Hunger in West Lafayette, Indiana, or in Gary, Indiana, connect with the stories of Voices of Hunger in Singapore, connect with stories of Voices of Hunger in Bihar, in India. Think how powerful that is.
Yeah.
Because what you recognize there is that these stories, they have their nuances, they are cultural, they are local, yes, but they have threads that connect across them and that connect people together in the kind of economic injustices amidst which they live their lives. It's the same in the US. For consistently the narratives, if you look at the Voices of Hunger narratives there, it is that people often having decent jobs, having a home, having a shelter, a decent life, and then being out in the street overnight. So one of the campaigns that we had first worked on that project was built around this notion of this could happen to any of you.
But the difference is that if it happens to us, the people like us, we have the social networks, we have the connections, we have so much to come back.
Do we though, Shrivi?
Yes,
Uh,
and
us
yes,
No, but that's
in
the
the
thing.
sense
When
that,
it
but,
gets picked
Us
but
up,
meaning
not
whom?
what I'm saying is the ones who are privileged.
no, exactly
But the
that.
ones
When it
who are
gets picked
not.
up by media, where as a success story, it becomes a story of tenacity, a story of persistence and
Not the social
good
networks.
management, even
Right.
rather than
But it's
being
not
privileged and
yes,
having all these
because that-
networks.
because even if any day, even if we were in a contract level, but we have so much in terms of invisible connections and networks and ties that help. But the thing is that in their case, they keep on going from one to the other, and sometimes it doesn't even matter who's employing you. The violence remains the same. They go to from the employer's place, they go to the shelter. In the case of the domestic helpers, there again there is violence. Again there is another
Right.
structure.
Another layer.
So it's not that they're getting away from that and they're going back easily, and the next they can be sure that the next employer is going to be
Yes.
less
But
cruel.
you know, Shrivi, one thing that is striking to me, at least in the US context, when we were doing this, and that's maybe because we were doing this in 2008, 9, 10, financial crisis. The one thing that really struck me was that there were people like us, meaning people working in very middle income, middle class jobs, having your 2-story house, you know, 2 cars, going from there to being on the street after being laid off within 5 months. And you know, the thing that was very apparent was the lack of, you know, the social network we talk about, the lack of that, you know, so this articulation that those networks, actually so many friends, they started going away. You know, we realized then that there actually was nobody to come in and take you in.
And this is pretty much the stories for
Actually,
Yes,
they are,
that's true.
yeah,
That's
the,
true.
the financial,
That's the
I would
real
just say,
face of it.
everybody seems to even with the Voices of Hunger project in Singapore, it's an abandonment of the various social support that they previously have. So some of them, their brothers and sisters are working for Exxon, making tons of money, but refused to help them when they were homeless. So you know, even it's very interesting because with the FDW project, the lack of social support has perpetuated further violence because it makes them more vulnerable to abuse. But if they are able to get some form of social support, they can run.
Yes.
They can get out of that.
Yes.
Whereas in the Voices of Hunger project,
It's a
out
trap.
of it.
it
Yes.
It continues
Yeah.
again.
But then you know something which is very interesting, albeit from a position of extensive privilege, right? The US project started making me very insecure, thinking about my own personal relationships, thinking that if I don't have a job today, you know, all these networks, they look so good, but are they going to be there? Are there going to be people that can take in,
are you going to be there,
you know?
like after I leave?
and it's so interesting because Chomsky, he wrote about how student debts are a way of ensuring discipline in a society such that they cannot get out of the trap of capitalism in that sense, because this huge student, you know, you have huge
Right.
student loans
And then
to
they
pay.
have to work within that.
And I'm just thinking about that in my own personal situation where Jpal has a $400,000 debt for going to vet school and coming out of that, you know, that now what other option? He does not have the option of being alternative in his job forms or his job choices, or you know, or trying to do something different because he needs the money. And so of course he'll feed into the corporate interest,
Yes.
you know.
Let's.
Most of you know that we're working on the conceptualization of health for domestic workers living in Singapore. The purpose and aim of this study was to explore the various health meanings and experiences of domestic helpers living in Singapore and to develop health communication interventions that serve the health needs of this vulnerable group. I will talk about vulnerability in a while, but the idea behind this is really to understand what does health mean to these foreign domestic workers, as well as what sort of consequences, health consequences they might face living in a very intimate space with their employer. And we hope to co-create solutions in developing health communication interventions. This was lifted from the IRB, so I think Daniel is looking at it. I've read this somewhere. So the whole, I was thinking that this was to a target audience that might have not been exposed to the FDW project, so that's why I created this slide. But anyway, most of you know that we are in dialogue we have conducted in-depth interviews with about 30 domestic workers so far, and we have already conducted 3 focus groups, and now we're actually moving into the advisory board phase where we are co-constructing solutions on what they can do based on the interview data that we have gathered in terms of advocacy and so on. So we are trying to then open participatory spaces in national discourse so that there can be better policies, or if they articulate that better policies need to be in place, then we have to come up with some form of advocacy solutions, or they come up with advocacy solutions with us in addressing some of the needs or the consequences that they have faced when living with their employers or with the agents. So the vulnerability, I'm going to talk a bit about the story of Navjot, because I think she encapsulates this paragraph quite nicely. The paragraph says domestic helpers from a vulnerable segment of Singapore's population. The group faces many problems, including adjustment to a foreign environment, complicated immigration and employment processes, and exploitation by employers. These problems are a catalyst to other issues such as inaccessibility to healthcare and lack of social support. And I specifically highlighted healthcare and lack of social support in relation to the story of Navjot. So Navjot was a domestic helper that I met at the shelter quite recently. She basically hails from India. She comes from India, and she was, I think, because in the shelter, or a dominant group of FDWs generally come from Indonesia or Philippines, she stood out in that sense because she didn't seem to fit into that group, and I think that's why many of us took notice of her quite immediately. And when she told her story, of course, we were more in tune with finding out more. So Navjot was actually badly beaten up by her employer, and she was locked in a storeroom for long periods of time. She has basically had zero social support, and the employer has completely isolated her at home for a year. So she basically knows no one, she has no outside networks, nobody speaks the same language that she does. So it was almost impossible to get help. So one day she managed to get access to her phone, and she messaged her brother back in India saying that she has been locked in the storeroom and she's being badly beaten up by her employer. Her brother managed to get in touch with Prime Minister's office. Prime Minister's office informed the MOM. MOM got an appointment for her to come down to see them. When she didn't turn up, they sent police officers to come and pick Navjot up from the house. Why is her story? I mean, there are many other stories that are pretty much similar to her being abused, physically abused, sexually abused, and so on. But in her case, it made it much harder because she is a Punjabi Catholic. Predominantly, Punjabis are Sikhs that come from the Punjab region, but she comes from the Punjab region, but she happens to be Punjabi Catholic. There is a community of Punjabi Christians in Singapore, but they make up a very niche community. So there are a lot of domestic helpers who are Punjabi Sikhs, and they very easily network with each other because it's easy to find each other. Those spaces are easy to identify. In the case of Navjot, it's pretty much impossible to find the appropriate type of community that she can identify with, where she will have no language barriers, because they are such a small group that it requires almost some form of network to get to them. Fortunately, I've managed to get in touch with a pastor who's Punjabi and who does Punjabi services, where they have other foreign domestic workers that are also Punjabi Christians that she can network with, and I hope to do that over the weekend to put the 2 groups together. So in this case, she clearly suffers from the fact that she has to adjust to a very foreign environment, especially from where she comes from, that is very different. So she described how food, living in an employer's house, she had to eat rice for an entire year when her usual staple is bread. Okay, so even the idea of food translates into being unable to adjust to a new foreign environment in that space. Complicated immigration and employment processes. So a lot of these helpers, the biggest issue or the biggest theme that emerge is contracts and agencies and the complicated nature of how their employment process actually takes, and exploitation by employers, of course. I've identified 3 themes for today's presentation, but I'm not going to go into the contracts and agency part, even though that is the largest aspect, because it can get very complicated and it might be very draggy as well, considering the time constraint. So I'm going to talk about physical and material struggle in relation to the structure. So the first issue is food. Many of them actually describe their experiences with food, and it emerged as a big frame of their inability to keep their health because food is a perennial problem. It also cannot be surveillanced because they live in a very isolated space that, it's very hard to kind of surveillance that space, and how much food they're getting cannot be sort of surveillance by anyone, right? Because they live in a very confined space. And even though it's the employer is legally bound to provide sufficient food to their FTWs, who is going to actually determine that, right? It's almost impossible to determine if the employer is providing this or meeting this legally bound contract that they need to fulfill about food, but they do not do that. Considering the fact that they also do very heavy physical and manual labor, having an inaccess to food could jeopardize a lot of their health, or could take consequence to their health quite a bit. So food came up as something quite predominant among the team, that was quite predominant among the helpers, as well as the kind of food they get was a problem. So a lot of them felt that this was not the right food for their body because they come from a very different cultural space, very different cultural environment. So lack of food, inaccess to food throughout the day, so only at certain times, and finally the kind of food was a problem. So here are a few excerpts. After that, I work in the house. The employer, she didn't give the food. I give the rice 1 week, 1 time. After that, I'm mopping all the house, my hands, and then after that, my employer, ma'am, said, can I take the 1 bread? She said no. The child, the ma'am child, she said, I can give me the 1 piece of bread. She said no, you must drink only water. You must wait what time you eat, and then after that, my hands, my whole body are shaking. Okay, here she describes her experience of inaccess to food and the consequence to her body and to her health. Another excerpt from the interviews that have been conducted so far. There's not enough food, so that's why I realized that it's okay to stay in my country, cause in my country even not enough money, but you can eat. Basically, you can eat at any time. Food, just because you don't have money, that doesn't mean you have inaccess to food. So she's saying that coming here to work, that whole idea of the labor, or this idea that if I get this job, I will be promised all of these resources, has clearly failed. Clear indication of the failure of this contractual agreement. Another case of deprivation of food, and she explains how another helper had to come and hand her biscuits through the house gate because she wasn't getting access to food. So this was one of the after contracts and agency, this was food became one of the big themes that emerged from the 30 interviews and focus groups that were conducted so far. Second, physical abuse, rape and violence. Once again, these sort of abuses become quite prevalent simply because the nature of the space they live in puts them at risk for their sexual safety is at risk because of the nature of the space. So, time and time again, there was an articulation of their safety and security being jeopardized. They had issues of physical abuse and some instances of sexual abuse as well. I didn't put up the full excerpt because it can be quite painful to read, but here she describes how her employer pulled her hair 3 times over something quite trivial, and how she points fingers, and basically how the helper lives in fear. They abused me, beat me, my brother-in-law touched me. Here's a case of sexual harassment as well, or sexual abuse. And because a lot of them fear losing their work. When they lose their work, this means having loans that they have incurred not paid because they're not getting an income. A lot of them do not go out and complain unless it's a very desperate, or they feel that they're cornered and they have absolutely no choice, and that's when they run. This is another case of, unfortunately, this is a case of rape. So she describes her account of how she was raped by her agent, another gatekeeper of an individual.
Agent.
Yeah, the agent actually raped her. So, it's very interesting because there seems to be gatekeepers of their selves in every aspect of their lives when they come to Singapore. So if it's not the employer, it's the agency, or sometimes if it's not the agency, when they go to an NGO, they are also then very restricted, or their movements are very restricted, and they are surveillanced as well in that space. So in the case of the FDWs, it seems like all aspects of their life as soon as they come to the country, all aspects of their life has been surveillance. Yep. Any questions so far?
This is an agent in Singapore.
In Singapore. All of the interviews were conducted in Singapore, so all of these stories are. I actually had a very interesting example for all of you to think about. Just imagine having to live in Mohan's house for a long-term period. Your employment is bound to living in Mohan's house. I think that is what the helpers go through. So the nature of the work in itself is already extremely difficult, because in no such setting we are all, we have time to separate ourselves from our work. After this, we don't have to see Mohan anymore. We are not in an office. We're not in an office where Mohan sits and constantly looks at us, right? There's no panopticon for the. Sorry.
Or so you think.
I was thinking exactly about that 2 slides before. Because I was thinking that how this space of domestic workers, their workspace is usually the space where everyone else gets the relaxation and being himself or herself.
Yeah.
And then, so there's no escape for this girl or guy, usually girl, right?
Yeah, good.
Yeah. So, anytime.
I remember
Surveillance.
in that talk we had earlier on labor, how these same groups encountered the same kinds of violence over and over again, because I remember interviewing her, and she was also raped by her employer.
She was also raped by him.
Also, so this is like the be all and end all of it, it's like after being raped by the employer, going back to the agency, and the agent is also sexually
And
harassing
this
her.
is precisely why I think it's so, why I had that personal mission of getting that girl in touch with a particular church service. It's not because of anything else. It's that there's just no guarantee that the next house she gets transferred to is going to be a heaven. That
Right.
So she needs the network to help support her.
If she had some form, and this is why social support becomes so important for these girls.
And still we are not talking about, the sexual desire from the employer becoming the everyday living fact for the girl. Before it actually happens, and then you got the hint, but then maybe you refuse, or maybe it didn't get carried out, but then you still have to live in the fact that, he always have that kind of drive, and you always have to maintain a certain kind of workable relationship. Is it working? Yeah, I was thinking of that as well.
So I think the nature of their work predisposes them to a lot of exploitation and a lot of abuse. Whether it is sexual abuse, whether it's a lack of food, and then finally going on to work overload and adequate rest or day off. So now, once again, imagine the scenario. We are all living in Mohan's house, and on a Saturday and Sunday too, we are still living in his house. Just imagine that situation. So pretty much I'm trying to convey the point here that these people have to lodge with their employers, which means that their rest day gets very ambiguous, or that can be very much exploited, very easily, because the power is really in the hands of one person or one individual. And if we talk about surveillance, we hear all of these employers having video cameras in their house to monitor the helper. But who is surveillancing the employer on behalf of the helper? There is pretty much none. So because they lodge in the same space, a lot of times there is no separation between work and day off, and this means having to constantly clock in hours, even though it's a Sunday. And if they are, depending on how strong-willed the helper is, she might or might not be able to exercise her right to leave that space, right? And so a lot of them complain about how they are overloaded with work, they need rest, they're not given rest, their Sundays are taken away from them, and they constantly, the days that they do decide to rest, they receive constant complaints from their employer about resting. So in this case, I thought this one was very disturbing. I mean, I can't imagine how people can be so sick in their head to torture somebody like that. So she makes the helper massage her for 7 hours straight while she sleeps. So she would wake the helper up at any time and then ask her to massage her for 7 hours straight, And this would mean 7 or 8 hours straight. So this could mean that she's sleeping at 12 midnight, the employer comes to her and says, you need to massage me, gets her to take a taxi all the way to whatever hotel that this person might be living in, and then gets her to massage her for a couple of hours.
Why in a hotel?
I think I'm curious to know why a hotel as well, but this girl, she sort of mentioned in the transcriptions that she was made to go to a hotel and give her employer a massage. Maybe the employer is having a weekend, what is that called? Staycation. Yeah, and this is the kind of sadistic behavior they enact.
God.
Yeah.
The third line from the from
7 hours at a go, who can stand that much massaging?
She would die from an over massage. I'm surprised she
Yeah.
hasn't.
You would think so, right?
Which kind of massage is this?
Third line from
Straight,
bottom.
right?
Yeah.
It is very strange, you know.
Once you
Over an
Yeah, so
hour,
that's
I
the
get
part that
very.
we didn't-
Oh.
we
I
didn't
can't take
manage
it anymore.
to get, yeah.
No, I mean, yes.
Because some of their English is not very, some of them may not have very fluent, so they might have said that word in Tagalog or something.
Yes.
Yeah. So, very sick employers.
Wow.
So, Julio, this is Julio's picture, very interesting budget mate. Let's see how we can pretty much constrain them or exploit as much of our money from them
Wow.
that we have invested in them as possible,
Wonderful
right?
picture.
This is the ultimate neoliberal
Yes.
statement.
Wow.
So part of the problem also becomes that when these women want to seek some form of help, if they fall ill or if their health takes a turn for the worse, you know, it's not like they can go to a hospital, not like they can find some form of treatment because there is a gatekeeper they need to bypass, or the gatekeeper needs to act to be cooperative with them for them to be taken to some form of healthcare, or for them to receive some form of healthcare. So here are some of the excerpts, and I thought once again this is very interesting. You come from a space that is much poorer than Singapore, right? You come from a developing country. You know, you think you're going to that the grass is going to be greener. You come to this new space. You have got this contract. You know, you'll get better employment. You will have more money and so on. And then you find out that hey, in Philippines I get treated better. I have more access to healthcare there than I do here. And yes, she says, how come in Philippines, if I'm already had a small rashes, my mother already want me to see doctor. Although sometimes it's expensive, we don't have money, still can afford and can do a way of money here. Why here they have and they cannot? So it's such an interesting conundrum, right? The expectation of having all of these resources in fact is completely removed in this space. And then the second a second excerpt of how the employer finds different ways to kind of ensure that no more money is taken out from their resources to pay for the helper, and they go about by giving them their own concoctions of what they think might be appropriate for their healthcare.
It's not really their own concoction. It's actually it's like a over-the-counter kind
yeah.
of cough syrup.
What
Yeah.
is people?
But in their own concoction, in
cough
their
syrup.
own from their
Yeah.
own cultural.
Yeah.
Oh,
Space.
Pibakao,
Yeah.
okay.
You see, as
Ibaga,
Singaporeans,
right.
I think we know,
Yeah.
you know, for it comes from our cultural context,
Mhm.
whereas for
Yeah.
these women, they might not have been exposed to these drugs before, and for them, that's not called treatment, or that's not the kind of treatment that they normally envision as they should be receiving, or they envision as receiving. So yeah, so pretty much these were the few themes that I wanted to bring across and I wanted to share, especially since we're sharing about fieldwork and experiences, and I thought these were quite interesting. All of this were actually taken from Sarah and I think the previous CCA's class their work and the interviews that they have conducted. Unfortunately, Sarah couldn't be here today, so I'm presenting this on her behalf. She sent me actually quite a bit of this material. So I hope I have done some justice to the presentation. But as I go along now, and I'm getting more and more familiar with the FDW work, and I find that the most rewarding because you really feel that if you don't want to have any moral judgment, or you don't want to have any sort of you don't want to have that gatekeeping mentality, then I think that the FDW or the domestic helpers seem to be the most subaltern, if there can be such a statement. They're the most subaltern group in Singapore. Whereas I find myself more in a conundrum when we talk about the Voices of Hunger project. Yeah.
Thank you, Sophie.
Any questions? Daniel might actually be a better person to answer the question.
I've been involved since the beginning. Don't look at me, ask questions to her.
I was thinking that at the very beginning of CARE project, Sarah and I were doing the media analysis of domestic workers.
Right.
What we got from 1 year's or even more than 1 year's reports were only like mainly about hang the clothes safely and then debate about that, and nothing like overwork, especially rapes and employer cruelty, something like that. At that time, I was thinking, what's wrong with this media? And then I suspected that there should be more, but definitely there is more. That's my comment. Then when I was listening to this, I was also thinking about the slavery exhibition
Downstairs.
Downstairs. And then they comment. So my question is, in a way that domestic maid or domestic worker as a euphemism has already institutionalized this group of people into a kind of social category or social structure. And then how do you think of modern day slavery? Do they fit this group? And then if that's the case, how do you justify this group of people being called modern day slaves? Do you think it's proper?
It's not good PR. Not good PR at all.
But also, can I sort of share from sort of a bird's eye view of our data through the life of the projects, right? It also seems that there is a lot of variance, meaning a lot of variance. So you have in a very extreme kind of situation, someone being beaten and locked up. But you also have other kinds of situations, with many of these situations really relating to agency and misunderstanding or misinterpretation of contracts, or miscommunication of contracts.
But then I was thinking about this, remotely Uncle Tom's Cabin. He was sold from the first his cabin by a very lenient owner. And then in the end, before he dies, his young master actually went there to see him. So what I'm thinking that is social structure, in a sense of social structure, has this group of people being positioned into
I think another
kind of like
I'm a bit cautious of saying that at the moment, because our methodology also confines us to a very separate group of women who are in shelters.
Right.
So the fact that they are already in shelters means that they are really
facing problems.
They're already part of the extreme cases of FDWs in Singapore. So
this is really an empirical question that needs to be answered by looking at the extent to which. And so we are going to actually do a survey. But even with that, I'm not sure how accurate you get with the data, So there have to be many data points to really evaluate that, because I think you also need to look at contracts, how many contract violations have taken place, what recourse do they have. In some places it definitely does feel like that. Like you have no recourse, you have no escape even, you're stuck in Singapore, you're not making any money, you're at the home shelter and that's where you're living. You don't have tickets to go back home, or you don't have your passport back with you. So those situations are just absolutely, you feel like you're stuck in a cage,
And no union. I mean, this
No
is
union.
they are not
No union.
protected under the Employment Act.
But then there is that TA, Manpower, what is that called? The government wing of that NGO that works with migrant workers?
MOM?
No, Migration Association or something. Remember they were there at that talk,
Migrant Workers Council?
Migrant Workers
Oh,
Council.
yeah, the
WC?
one, the right at the end, the NTUC there.
Yes.
I think so.
And they would claim that they try to do a union representation as good as that. But they are basically,
Mm.
I think they're stepping up. And to talk about the media reports, more reports of abuse are coming out now.
yes.
And employers getting their just desserts.
Right.
Yeah,
Mm.
it's coming out in the media now. But yeah, I think even as recent as a couple of years ago, these reports weren't.
As prevalent.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, like I was just reading when writing the Little India paper, the literature review for that, the role that the media plays in reinforcing stereotypes or exaggerating stereotypes in that sense. And in this case, clearly the media does not feel it should be a gatekeeper of, or it should be pushing out such agenda. It's clearly kind of withdrawn itself from these stories, because if they wanted to get access to these stories, it's so easy. Just speaking, going down to home one day and meeting up with this woman, you get a whole host of stories that that need to be told and that need to be said, but clearly that hasn't been done. And if they wanted to, it's a very easy access to that. So I think the media is just as responsible as.
Having said that, I go back to Daniel's point, Satvi, do you see any changes? And the reason I say that is because when I was back here in 2008 and working on the same issues, from 2008 to now, I see changes.
Mm-hmm.
So like Zureda did a story on the the domestic worker being abused.
Mm-hmm.
She did a story of how you treat your domestic worker makes a lot of difference in terms of the kinds of values your children learn, So there are, and then Radha Basu will do stories. So it also does seem like there are stories that do bring up these kinds of issues. It's not as if, it doesn't seem like it's as if they are completely erased,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's again an empirical question to see from say 2000 till 2014.
We have to document to see
Right.
if there has been.
And what are the
Yeah.
frames? Have the frames changed? If so, how so?
I think there has been definitely, even in terms of MOM, enforcing some of these policies, like how they had a list of, so now MOM has come up with a list of agencies that they blacklist and they shame them on the
So,
MOM website.
yes.
So I'm sure that there is honestly, I don't think that the villain here
Is
is
the government.
the government in
Right.
the FDW case.
Right.
They are just very bureaucratic. They take long time to get to.
And they don't
get
have
to-
processes in place to monitor.
They don't have processes in place to monitor. It's just a long. They just basically need to get a bit quicker. But that is just an aspect that can be dealt with.
I'm just feeling they also have problems defining their jurisdiction, like how far they can exercise that kind of authority. I mean, I was reading the other day about how CASE, that handles all the consumer complaints, they get a lot of complaints about beauty products and all the stuff that doesn't fit the advertising. But then when the CASE chairman talked about what they can do, all they can do is just keep sending warnings to the producer, the company, and they can't actually do anything about it. They only can
Why?
make them sign. It's not within their jurisdiction. Even though they are a government agency, they only can send warning letters and then get them to sign a voluntary compliance form, and that's the extent of it.
But that is a problem with the government then, because it has created these structures, regulatory structures that are not empowered to implement these
Then it
regulations.
doesn't become business friendly.
Right. And I guess part of this also, the cynical part of this is that if you were to implement all of these, that would not be so nice to Singaporeans, no?
And also, what is we have to also think about why the government is so keen to have domestic helpers in the country. What was the point or the purpose in allowing that in the first place? It's because they wanted mothers to go to work and contribute to the labor force, and they wanted people to take, these mothers were not producing simply because they were laborers in the workforce. So they allow this, or they were being very cooperative in that sense by allowing domestic helpers and paying them pittance simply because they wanted Singaporean women to have more babies and be able to still contribute to the workforce. So the government too, I think, would have an agenda to not be so tight on its regulations with employers in that sense. That I think that they too have their own purposes
It's
and their
definitely
own.
part of a much larger problem.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's a big contradiction, is it not? That on the one hand, they're really supporting the mobility and the social inclusion of women in this country.
And yet at the same time,
And yet,
so the
exactly,
Women's
by
Charter
exploiting,
for
you know,
in
such
Singapore is
a-
so
such a
strong,
cynical.
but for Singaporean women, because the Women's Charter for
Yeah,
Singaporean women
Singaporean
is
women.
extremely strong,
Yeah,
you know,
sure.
but it's the reverse in the case if you are a
Exactly.
foreigner.
No, and I mean, you think about the case of sexual harassment, not just that is the case of workplace rape.
Mm.
It needs to be treated as such, like that. So when you're aware, and this is the thing where I find like things like aware are very privileged entities in some ways that turn a blind eye to these kinds of issues. Because for aware, this is an issue that needs to be taken up, which is, you know, a question of harassment, sexual harassment at the workplace
Yeah, yeah.
for domestic workers.
I'm just wondering whether AWARE is also one of an organization that is focused on the Singaporean woman. You know, it's also part of that divide, right? Like, I will protect the Singaporean woman, and the foreign woman is not part of that. That is accorded that same protection. So, but it would be interesting to see if they do actually take this up, and if they don't, why? What are the reasons for not doing so? Because this is clearly, if you want to talk about sexual harassment, if you want to report numbers saying that sexual harassment in workplaces are very low in Singapore, then this clearly presents a very different picture.
No, and because then my question is, what is the typical process for rape at workplace? You know, if a woman says that their boss raped them at the workplace, what is the legal process? What happens after that? Do the cops immediately come and arrest the boss, and then the proceedings take place?
If I'm not wrong, but I need to check this out, but the burden of proof lies with the employer, because as soon as a woman cries rape, the protection is accorded to the woman immediately, and you immediately go to the police, and the police will take action.
What does taking the action mean?
It could be possible arrest immediately.
So then the question is, with this woman, what was going on with the employer? What did they do with the employer?
No idea.
But
But again, they don't dare to make the police report because
yeah.
then, you know, the whole their work pass gets suspended.
And then isn't that the whole
Yeah,
problem
employment.
with the problem with delaying reporting of rape, that makes it even more complicated if you don't report rape immediately, right? So, but I do have faith in, you know, in that sense, that if a helper did go to the police and report rape, I would think that the employer would be charged immediately. And I do think that in that sense, enforcement is quite strong, but the problem is whether
The
the woman.
reporting part of it, whether the woman is.
But having said that, what is so interesting was that I was just sharing. I have mentioned that a family member happens to be in a quite high position in the police force, and I mentioned one of the stories, and the immediate response was, "You have to be careful because a lot of them lie." So you see, you cannot be so
That's a
gullible. You know.
very-
But you know,
commonly
it
used,
is so interesting, because for many of the women, why they are there? Because they have been accused of stealing.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, and the tears tell such a story, because like, if you're going to subject us to this, then give us the lie detector test immediately. Don't make us wait for all these months.
Yeah.
I think we can also take it in the same way like how we always do qualitative research, and we're always talking about you know, self-reporting how can you even tell whether the stories are authentic or not?
Yeah.
But actually it's not the point. Even if they were lying,
There is an issue there.
an issue, a reason to why they had to lie in the first place to get to this position where they felt was better, even if it was a lie.
Yeah.
If you think about it, everything is a lie, so to an extent,
And I'm also starting
cynical.
I'm also starting to think like whether there needs to be like an understanding of the rank and file police officer versus the people at the top, and whether there's a difference in their policing. So if this person, when the person goes to the police, right? To the station to report, or or the police officers that come at the first point of contact when they report abuse, those are rank and file police officers. They have pretty much very little power in pushing the matter further, and then from there it's people at the top that take that case, right? So I'm just wondering whether there's a difference in policing by the rank and file police officer when the case is reported, and then when it goes up. And is that why there's such a long process in terms of the
It was
investigation?
going to be an issue because there will be so many organizations involved, and not just be the police, then you have to go to the MOM, and then you get NGOs involved, so it's already 3 parties who bring in the employer, maybe the agent, then there are 5 people involved in one case already. Can you imagine how long it takes to resolve?
Yeah.
And what adds to that stress is the fact that when they're under investigation, they are not allowed to work at all.
Yeah.
So this then puts them at
Right.
further,
Further
stress
debt,
with their loans
yes.
and their debts and so on.
Satveen,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you.
So when I first entered in Singapore, I always heard the word Bangla.
Can you
Everybody can
desperate
pronounce
Wednesday
Bangla.
times
The
up?
way they pronounce
The
that
350.
Bangla is different than the way we say Bangla. But it means that there is a Bangla speaking community in Singapore, and I was being hired to work with them. I'm really lucky that I'm going to present this with you. What we did, I did 30, this is the methodology when Mohan told me to come and see. I'm not going to tell all these things because you can see the space of Singapore and structure. This is the commercial structure, high rise, and where are those migrant workers? And you can see the billboard over there is a place of Bangladeshi women. There are more than 100,000 Bangladeshi male migrant workers in Singapore who are a portion of these 20% low wage migrant workers in Singapore. And we did 31 plus Mohan did 3, altogether 37% being interviewed, and I'm going to share some of this experience with you, how it looks like. You can see, so this is their space. This is from a hotel where I use this my smartphone, and this is their space. There are no space for their sitting. So these are the invisible communities, 100,000 Bangladeshi, maybe 120,000 Bangladeshi. And this methodology we are using is like to foreground the voice of Bangladeshi migrant worker and to know their meanings of health. Obviously CCA fieldwork start in April 2012. Actually Mohan started in 2008, I should mention it. In 3 regions of Singapore, basically in Little India, Jurong East, NUH, and some other floating place where the interviewee asked me to go, I met them. So again, I want to show you the space. And these are the participants. Now, these are the invisible community. For doing my research, I found one of the Singaporean researchers who found photography and space of the migrant communities, and he put them or called them invisible community. This space next to the Mustafa, where they call it mini mart, where you will see the series of 1-story building where Bangladeshi products are being found. There is a small corner there, they call it Bangla mini mart area. Yes, this is the information about the participants what I shared in the last earlier session in the morning. Most of them, actually, it was my horrible experience when I found that a 16 years old plus boys registered as a migrant worker, but they put him in passport that 20 plus, and 45 plus. So through the personal and professional network they were being, most of them are, 80% of them have 11th grade education, which is HSC higher secondary level, so they can read and write well. And most of them have paid 4,000 to 7,500 Singaporean dollars. And when they get job, they could hardly make $16 per day. They call it basic salary or $20. Some of them can make 24. So out of their salary, they could hardly save $200 or $300 per month that they need to return to their families or pay their loans. So
This group of interviewees, most of them 31, were living in a special condition with the special pass of MOM when they are injured. So this is specific group. Again, this invisible pupil space. What I found that when regarding their race, they have a complex relationship with their three major stakeholders, employers, doctor, and MOM, who could help them. And again, if they have some access to some other agencies like NGOs, like there is a TWC2 and some lawyers, but sometimes those not working that much. Three different phases of their lives. They have the health experience, and one of them is like they understand that meaning of good life, good health is according to health and good better living condition, all these things. I am here informing you about some narratives after the injury when they're living in spatial past. Sometimes they are mentally really down and it impacts their sexual health. Personally, I got phone calls, see, I'm not feeling well, I feel that I'm physically becoming impotent, I'm going back to home, I have to marry, what should I do? I said, okay, please come down to NUH, and I make an appointment with a psychiatrist. But the way they are being treated, even getting an appointment in NUH or with other cultural doctors is not really good treatment. So there are a lot of gaps, and then when they feel that this is it, because this Bangla community is keen to their religious beliefs, so they feel that, the way they feel that from the Muslim background, that okay, we have to have clean food. So sometimes they don't feel comfortable with having food in a place where working side, sitting on a ground, like there is no, and next to a drain or open places on the top to rooftop or somewhere, anywhere, construction area, the way they got provide food during the working time. Again, when they get catering food, those are stinky. Sometimes rotten fish or rotten meats, all these things. The whole scenario that, especially during this condition with spatial pass, is really unhealthy situation. I will bring some of the cases, at least couple of cases. There are some scenario you can see that once, I don't want to see, one of the workers chopped. This is this hand. I made it a little bit blurred because, but you can see this kind of accident could happen, and you can see this kind of people around you. You won't see that because nicely bandaged, but this is part. This is the scar of hand. It's been chopped. These are the scar. These are the scar of beaten by the employer. When they say we don't have any meanings or tools, it's not true. You can see here Bangladeshi embassies has given a letter that employer did maltreatment, need medical assistance, all these things. But I don't know. This is the present secretary, labor secretary of Bangladesh. He didn't get back to me. But anyway, they have a mechanism getting a letter at least. But most of the workers, among these 35 I interviewed, 27 of them said they treat badly. When I gonna go to renew my passport, the fee is $195, and I asked for the rest of the $5. They said they throw it on my faces and say, "Oh, get it. We don't have change." Or like that. I was sharing with my colleague Daniel or someone else that this diplomats community, who is from upper middle class family, they feel that they are in a different blue collar job, and these people are dirty, so they have to be treated that way. So the most important part to intervention to make Bangladesh government and embassies feel that they are getting $13 million per year during the time of economic crisis. Last year they got 13 million plus. So, and the situation of migrant worker, I contacted with some other colleagues like in Jeddah and Qatar, is far better because at least they could claim, at least they could go to some places. Anyway, so here is a narrative. The problem is that in Bangladesh, when you live with a community, this second class, middle class educated community, you see that in Bangladesh we used to live in 2 or 3 people in one room. And this well-built house surrounded by the trees, natural resources, and here 28 people is one room. One bed is shared by 2 people. It is very unhygienic. There is nowhere to keep food, like you have some leftover food. You don't have a cabinet. Toilets insufficient, and always you have to be on the queue. In the morning they wake up 5 o'clock and they have to be in the queue and they have to be ready by 7. They will be in the port by 8:30, and since then until doing the duty 8 or 9 o'clock they could get back. On the way back they have to wait for the lorry again. They will come back to their dormitory by 10 and they have to queue for cleaning them, taking showers, and by 11:30 they could have meal, and after that they might have some more work. So these people are having going round the clock. They are not taking rest. Another important part is that all of them want to have work, extra work during the weekend because they will get overpaid or double paid, especially on Sunday. So there is no mechanism to judge them whether they are going crazy, all these things. And food is really stinky. And sometimes some of the people get diarrhea. For the first time when they come and meet and started working, some of the people really feel different. This is a Bangladeshi food place. It's in Sunle area next to the dormitory. I bought this food for me. This is the way they present. This is much more way, but the way catering house, this restaurant might be supplying food the next dormitories to the companies. I don't know, but it's really a horrible situation. This food I bought it for $6. I had with one of my friends who is a supervisor, but even this one is not really healthy, good. But we could judge the house. So, but when I was taking pictures, the owner of the restaurant came along and said that, see, you have to take the permission of the food court manager. I said, okay, I will do that. So this is just for my sample. So I'm not doing any harm to you or I'm not taking your pictures. Challenges a lot. There are list, I won't tell a lot, but all these are like a 3D works, like couple of interviews share me their stories. One of them, Imdad is underweight person, tiny, thin guys. He had to carry 50 kg cement bags, always. And although there are trolleys, he were never been allowed to use trolley because he was being bullied by his foreman. And always his employer, colleagues bullied him, verbally, orally, or physically. Like they are passing by, they put their leg a little bit aside so he will drop down, or push him on his head. So this man becomes so sick mentally. He contacted me a couple of times. I asked him to meet Devi for DICE, Devi and the Bashram or the TWC2. Finally he ended up with them, and he is living in special pass now. And other person, I will show you picture, that he used to work as a fixer of the air condition and wiring, but he's another culture foreman. He was like a sick person. To my understanding, maybe he's a sick person. If he need to carry one tool, he always have to go down from the 7 or 8 floors and carry one tool at once. He could carry all the tools within 2 or 3 steps. But he never allowed him. This kind of, it's not verbal even, it's kind of communication gap, cultural gap, they have to face every time, everyday life. And it creates lots of pressure. Like these guys, whose name is Chuel, he left already. He said that whenever I got a duty with this foreman, I feel fever in my whole body, and all other workers also. I said it made me sick to work with him. So this is a kind of mental pressure. And always employer, for the certain time employer, when they are injured, employer gives some compensation, some cost of the medical treatment, but it becomes lengthier, then different story. Finally they have to end up somewhere in Little India where there are some assistants or associate of lawyers with those firms. Those are another narratives. And always the accommodation, they don't think that health, accommodation is a part of the health. Never. Especially when they are in dispute with the employer, like the industrial that, yes, I'm really afraid that they also send me back, always, and rebuke me. They send me back to my country, and I have nothing to do. I have to commit suicide because I borrowed money. And I have a lot of dependents, including my sisters, who is getting education. They have to, so, sorry. So this is Ahmed's story. I didn't put his picture because he requested me, shared his story. What I could help him, I requested him, if he gonna take any severe decision, at least he will contact me. And he came last time. William, you have seen him, right? This type, tiny guy. Sometimes they are very scared of different gatekeeper and different stakeholders. You can see these people, especially in the supermarket. This is from Sunle area. Last week I worked in. You see the dirt there in the post office? Can you guess why they are there? They call it takachara.
To send money.
To send money. To send money every week or every month. So see, even this is 9 o'clock. They are in the queue. Working day. You will see them in the supermarket or complex area where they are in a queue. Post office take the money, and there are other places like. And the story, whatever it is, one of them share, at least not one of them, at least 7 of them share that when they have a dream, they will come to Singapore. This is a nice place like Europe or America, and they will get a job and they will buy lands, property, get married. They will fulfill their dream. Actually, in maximum cases, 20% could end up like this. And rest of them, 80% find themselves in a miserable situation. These are the number 5 case studies, persons. This is Joel. Joel would like to be a performer, and this is his certificate from the Debashram he got. He wear Bangladeshi dress. These are the color of our flags, Bangladesh, red and green. So he is happy, but his situation was like that. He was on a S-pass. This is the stamp. They call it chop. So every week, you can see every week, sometimes even 2 times they have to go in a week to MOM to get this job done. So you could count. These people are invisible. They live on these jobs.
So they have to report.
Right.
Every 2 weeks.
Right. When they got MC, medical leave, including they have to take the MC to the MOM down by themselves personally, and then MOM put a job that you are going to stay a couple of more weeks or you are going to stay a couple of more months. Joel left. Joel is one of the luckiest one. He got a negotiation through his lawyer and he got around 7,000 Singaporean dollar. He got a bank pay.
For what? For compensation.
For compensation. Somehow, after around 1 year, so he fall from 6 feet high ladder. I mean, there was nobody to hold the ladder for him. So he fall down, and his employer didn't allow or didn't pay money for his MRI, which is costly. So that's why. But doctor advised him some kind of jelly from his bone, get out, and it's a complicated case. I can understand what is this. He couldn't even sit for more than 10 minutes. So he was sitting next to me. He said, "You need to stand and you need to move." He always restless like that. So he get back. He's lucky. He put that money for his business in the manufacturing industry, second-hand shop. But this guy, I already mentioned you, most of the story is like that. He's going back. This guy used to work for MRT, but in his mind, or basically he is a singer, he's a really trained singer. And his voice is like a classical singer. He was the leader of the Bangladeshi migrant workers group, but he went back. He was sick for 3 or 4 months. He was been working in MRT, putting the fluids inside the holes, which sucks the water from this kind of, I know the name of the chemical, but he gets sick. He gets sick and doctor couldn't find anything. Then he left job, he went back. So most of the time you can see them around in the marketplace or in the airport with hues like this. He's from. So that's it. Thank you. Any question?
I think I have, I and Raman are a bit, so, all of the abuses seem extremely, it's very saddening to know, and it's quite similar to the FDW as well, and there seems to be so many issues. But there's one thing that was quite striking was the picture of the food that you considered bad, and to both Raman and myself, it looked quite appetizing. So I'm just wondering, why do the workers feel that might be maybe picture in a picturesque form it looks like.
No, I think there is a communication issue too. Rumi showed you the food that he bought paying $6.
Yeah.
So that is actually not an accurate depiction of the food that they get. When Kang and I saw the food that they get when we went with Health Serve, and it is actually in packets that they get the food, all food together, and often that food is stale. So the thing that they don't like, that they hate the most, is that the food can taste sour, or from the night before or the day before, and then it tastes stale. You know?
From
Because
the
when you said
natural yeast.
documentation, I was like, there's
And these
definitely
food
a
they could
problem
have
with
like
the-
once a week when they feel really difficult.
then they would
Then they go and buy from
But
them.
still, Rumi,
This is
what
not
you-
healthy
what
food also.
No, but what you showed there, that is not the catered food. You showed the food that you bought
Right.
at that place paying that
Right.
money.
That's I told. That
Right.
This is the standard of. This is the best standard of food to them, which they don't have access most of the time. But that I tasted. And they used to get, if you buy food, they used to get a lot of rice. Huge amount of rice.
I think the biggest, for me with the construction workers, like the biggest irony of all is the fact that they do the hardest labor. So if we talk about compensation to injury and so on, they should be the ones that have the most health insurance coverage.
Yes.
But they are the least likely to have health insurance coverage. And when you were saying about the success story of $7,000 for a back injury, relatively it seems like a success story, but in the bigger scheme of things, $7,000 is
No,
not
that's how.
returns.
That's his whole life. He couldn't sit 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I told you.
That's
So-
the price of his life.
Exactly. And
yeah.
in normal settlements,
Permanent injury.
this could mean a settlement of $500,000 for
Yes.
an injury like this,
Right.
But I guess relatively speaking, yes, it's a success story, but at the same time, I can't help but think that $7,000 for a back injury for the rest of your life is just ridiculous as well.
Yeah, and he had to wait 9 months for
To get it.
get the compensation.
Yeah.
And
And he was
Another-
been working closely with organization like the Basram, so he was serving all the things for Mr. Mohsin. He was like a manager at the same time, layman over there. So it's not really good.
I also
Good
think
luck.
with the construction workers, right, the government is a lot more accountable. I think they have to be a lot more accountable for them. For example, like the law, one thing that I absolutely think there needs to be greater advocacy for is forced expatriation, because I was arguing this with a lawyer, and the person said that the state has complete right to expatriate someone because in any circumstance, because the person doesn't belong to the state. But my argument is you can't expatriate someone that has contractual agreements in the country, but at the same time, you can't have basically that you can't just expatriate them without any judicial proceedings if they have a contract in place, But who gives, just because a law is in place that says that the state has full authority to expatriate anyone from the country, that doesn't make it right. And to me, that seems to be something that looms over the heads of the FCW a lot, because they have there seems to be no concrete why should that be the case? That doesn't make sense to me. You can be expatriated for absolutely no reason, and that's just because the state has that right. Whereas this person has come and done labor work for you and is in a contract with you. So why is that the case? That to me seems to be a huge policy, like something that needs to be discussed, especially in the case of the Little India riots as well. People who said that they did not participate in the riots were then expatriated. They were immediately expatriated. They were immediately removed from the country. But then the point is, it's easy. The rationale that was given by the MP herself, she said that that's because going through judicial proceedings for all of these people that they have arrested would mean hitting taxpayers' money. They would take up a lot of taxpayers' money. But where's the justice in that sense? Where's the justice for these construction workers in that sense? So to me, that seems to be very unfair, and it's very unjust, and something that needs to be changed.
You know why these people escape from the dormitory? Because when see that they have a word called gangster, and these people, they said Tamil gangster.
Mm-hmm.
These people, gangster, work for the employers. They quickly come to the dormitory and pick the people and send them back to the airport.
They can repatriate.
With absolutely no.
No.
Sorry.
So actually, and
That's
this came
their
out in
most
my
common,
fieldwork
right.
a lot in 2008, which was that the gangsters would come if you have an injury, say, they would come simply pick you up because they don't want to pay for any of the medical expenses. And say if you break your arm, the worker would be trying to escape because they know that if they don't, the gangsters will come, they will pick you up, and they will expatriate, they will, repatriate you.
But I think that is so. So where's the where's
There
the
is no
mechanic?
process.
There is no
So
process at all.
this is precisely
I don't
why I
know.
say that
Right.
in this case, the government is a lot more accountable from like everything that Rumi has mentioned, and with what you're mentioning about these gangsters. I thought we are supposed to be a crime-free state with, we pitch this story or this narrative about how Singapore is safe and we are crime-free, and they have control over the gangs here. But at the same time, clearly this has come up
I
as
think the other piece of the story that maybe I think Rumi didn't cover was the actual employers themselves, because you obviously couldn't go and interview them, but I think lately in the news they've been painting them as also people who are involved in all this injustice. And it's very difficult because at least from the news stories I read, most of them are actually foreign companies, foreign construction companies. So they feel that they don't have to follow the jurisdiction of Singapore. So especially like the ones in China, that come from China, they think that they just follow Chinese law and there's no laws to protect
Labor law.
No
But those
laws.
would be easier to handle though. If they're foreign companies,
thing-
then their license to operate in Singapore.
can be easily
The thing is
revoked.
Exactly.
more
But
complicated
see,
than that.
again, Singapore has the demand for construction. They can't just keep
Yeah.
revoking all the licenses willy-nilly like that. So again, it's a whole big system.
But and then you complain about your human rights abuses, your America constantly putting you as part of like one of the biggest criminals of human rights abuses in the country, and you wonder why. Clearly, this doesn't. They clearly don't see that this is clearly.
And it came up really back all the way when I did the IRB for this project again was the one that has the highest demand for construction services in Singapore is the government.
Yeah,
the
because they are the
HDB
ones that
They need the housing services.
80% of our housing is HDB. Of course, so 80% will actually
So they
be.
have a huge demand for construction services. It's not like they're going to start surveying all the different construction companies and making sure that
But then imagine what would the scenario look like if the workers were organized.
One of my interviewees told me that when the MOM comes to survey them, actually they got the notice the previous day by MOM. And then so they are not going to ask the workers to work on those parts of the construction project where they do not have enough safety procedures. So basically the MOM officers can go to this place, but then say that this is
it's okay.
It's sanitized.
It doesn't, sanitize.
It's the same when we went for the migrant workers panel. The
Yes,
MP was saying
yes.
the dormitories are wonderful.
They live in
have a
wonderful-
gym there.
And this is precisely why documentation is so important. Anti-narratives of what the government is saying, all of
Yes.
these bullshit surveys that are clearly
Yes.
partisan, right?
Right.
So, I think this is where academic research is
Yes.
such a strong
Yes.
method to push against the agenda the government
Right.
is trying to.
But then you see, it also has to be academic research that
It's not.
that is not scared to put its neck out.
Yeah.
It cannot be academic research that ends up just making some meta commentaries. These are the exact kinds of things you need to document.
This is where like the empirical data becomes
Right.
so crucial,
Right.
it seems to me.
If you go with a couple of pages, multiple choices question and fill it up,
And very
that's
easily
kind of
done,
academic research going on.
I mean, to really the key issues. It's not a long survey, right?
just the
It's
beginning
maybe
of-
like a
just the beginning
2-3 page
of-
survey.
Yeah.
You can get the key issues out.
And we have the ability to even pay some amount, which I'm sure will help. I mean, unfortunately, I think that will be an incentive for all
To
of
get
you
the surveys done.
Yeah, and we must use the communities themselves to push the surveys out, because I think the trust factor is clearly absent. I mean, why should they trust us? I don't see why I would want to trust anybody from Singapore if I was a FCW or if I was a FDW, right? Like, why would you want to trust me?
But I feel that if care could support or someone come up, at least they need some interpreter, Bangla speaking interpreter in the hospitals, in MOMs or different places. Though those are not professional interpreter. This could be volunteer, like the way they are working with home or TWC2. If we could find some people, that would be helpful. First intervention.
But this is where I feel like the government also has to be accountable for these services. They cannot keep washing their hands off, helping like with civil society issues.
But the government does have interpreters, for instance, that will show up with the MOM hearings. But then the workers will constantly say that they feel that these interpreters are not translating properly. So they are Bangla interpreters, upwardly mobile or aspiring to be upwardly mobile. So they will translate things that are only convenient.
Right.
And the other layer I want to add to this, sometimes at least, the data suggests that sometimes the abuse happens because of other Bangladeshi middle people.
Like the foreman.
Like agents, foremen, lawyer, assistants, These caterers are Bengali mostly as well.
I'm just curious to know, are they Singaporean Bengalis or are they Bangladeshi Bengalis?
They are Bangladeshi Bengalis who have gotten PRs mostly.
Right. The lawyers, associates are the peer.
They are the
PRs.
Yeah. So they are actually Singaporeans lah. Like they are because I think then it becomes convenient to if these narratives come out, it becomes convenient for the government to say, hey, it's their own people exploiting their own people, it's got nothing to do with us.
Right.
So we don't need we can take a step back. But if they are PRs, I think they are still considered as Singaporeans, and I think that makes them much more accountable.
Same with the Bangla catering services. If you want to run a business, you have to be at least PR. So.
And then these catering services will advertise in the bashroom in Bangla Gonto.
So I can feel now that why they are scared of academic research.
because it will expose this stuff.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the Bangla people, because and this is something I was telling Rumi, you see, the Bangla people, they are fine with some Chinese Singaporean scholar sending in another Chinese Singaporean postdoc who hires them as RAs to do this, and they are fine with this because that keeps the status quo ensconced, where the Bangla people themselves who are in these structures benefit from. It's a lot more threatening for us to be in this space because we get direct access to other kinds of narratives which are not very, which don't show much good light on these people who are ensconced in this power structure and benefiting from it, you know.
Right.